Hello, everybody, and welcome to Charts with Dan. We are looking at the box office as we come out of the Halloween holiday weekend. If you want to call it a holiday weekend, it's a holiday where we live. We're also going to look at the life and legacy of a true Hollywood, really worldwide global icon who passed away, and all the other streaming stuff and everything we look at every week. But let's look and start with the box office chart for this past weekend here at the domestic box office. And at the number one spot is a movie called Come Play. And yes, we are at the pandemic box office. There are always asterisks, but this is kind of impressive, the fact that it was able to get to number one. Gillian Jacobs being the biggest star in the film. A pretty big gulf between that and the number two film, which is Liam Neeson's Honest Thief. That remains there at number two. Then The War with Grandpa at number three. Tenet still in the top five at number four, even though we'll look at its outlook when it comes to the global box office, but it's still hanging in at number four. And then The Empty Man, which debuted last week, has bumped out all of the Halloween-related things. We've seen Hocus Pocus and Nightmare Before Christmas and a lot of Halloween-related titles out of the top five. So back to a what you might call a regular top five, at least a non-Halloween top five with the re-releases that have been going on. As we look at the domestic list for 2020 so far, no changes. We've been talking about the fact that, Tenet is on a very slow crawl, and at this point it is really slowed down to a trickle. Let's not kid ourselves. This is going to be the top 10 for a while. Not much change that's going to go on there. And, if Wonder Woman 1984 does not come out in December, which who knows at this point, we could very well be looking at the number one grosser of the year having come out back in January at Bad Boys for Life with just under $205 million there. But we're not quite there yet. We still don't know what Wonder Woman 1984 is going to do. Although, even if it does come out, what kind of numbers is it going to do? We don't know. Let's look at the global chart for 2020. And a movie that we've been talking about for the last couple weeks has now muscled its way into the top 10. And that movie is Demon Slayer. Demon Slayer, the movie, is now the number 9 top film at the worldwide box office. It cracked the $150 million mark, and this is all from Japan. This is a phenomenal number for any movie coming out of Japan. They're at number 9. Invisible Man drops down to number 10. That drops onward out of the 2020 worldwide top 10. That would be a disaster, and it is a disaster to a certain extent for Pixar, but given what everyone's gone through this year, the analysis doesn't exist really to put that in context, because there is no context really. Even though there have been worldwide pandemics and epidemics before, not with the kind of modern movie industry and everything else. There's no context for what's happening this year, but it does drop onward out of the top 10. And then you see Tenet there at number 4, and I talk about its prospects. Remember, the double the budget number is what you want to look for, as you go into other ancillary things coming in for the movie to make money. Tenet there still, it's at about $350 million. So it hasn't really been able to get a whole lot closer to that $400 million just to start talks about how it is going to break even. But there is some bad news when you look worldwide. There's some bad news globally. Of course, we've seen a resurgence of cases here in the United States. The theater industry worldwide is now kind of going back into lockdown mode. Let's look at just some of the restrictions that have been put in place here in the last couple of weeks. The UK has several restrictions, but England specifically, theaters are closed there until at least December 2nd. They are going back into lockdown mode. Very limited activity allowed there. Then in Germany, theaters are closed for at least 4 weeks starting today in Germany. In France, theaters are closed until at least December 1st. In Italy, theaters are closed until November 24th. In Spain, theaters are open in most places. However, there are nationwide curfews in effect that impact the number of showings, particularly in the evening. In Greece, theaters are closed through November. In Belgium, theaters are closed until December 13th. And then here in the United States, of course, New York City and Los Angeles still has all of its theaters closed, and Regal, except for a few select places in California, has closed its theaters nationwide. So this is important to know as we monitor, again, particularly going into December, Wonder Woman 1984 and what it's going to do, because it doesn't just have a United States, North American release to think about. It has a global release to think about, and we are seeing theaters reclosing in areas where they had advanced far beyond even where the United States had gotten as far as cases and things being opened back up. Italy held the Venice Film Festival not too long ago, now shutting down movie theaters again. So this is the thing to watch, is the resurgence around the world, how it affects the theaters opening and what is staying open. China and Japan right now are driving the box office for the entire world. No remarkable resurgences reported as of yet in either of those countries. We will see as time goes on. But the hope perhaps that the global box office would largely be recovered by the end of the year is looking fainter and fainter as we move on week to week. Of course, we'll continue to monitor. Hopefully these lockdowns and restrictions in Europe and elsewhere work, and the case numbers go down, and you can start again the process of reopening businesses. But we just don't know. There are so many X factors out there that we don't know right now. So transitioning to some sad news that we found out about yesterday, we note the passing of people on the show whose lives have touched art and touched Hollywood, touched movies in so many different ways. Well, there are few that you could categorize as a true icon, but one of them passed away. It was announced yesterday that Sir Sean Connery passed away at the age of 90 after a long battle with illness. And, it's hard to quantify or qualify what exactly someone like Sean Connery meant to decades, generations of moviegoers, starting in the 50s until he retired largely from making movies in the early 2000s. But even then, people continued to discover his films, people continued to watch his films. And so I wanted to take more than a moment. I really wanted to take a segment here on the show to talk about Sean Connery and what his legacy was at the box office. I mean, obviously, he impacted things in so many other ways than just numbers and facts and figures. But this is a numbers and facts and figures show. But even so, when you look at what he was able to do across decades, it is really pretty staggering. So first, looking at Sir Sean Connery's top 5 hits worldwide, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade was number 1 with almost $500 million. Now, keep in mind these numbers. We're going to look at some inflation-adjusted numbers. These numbers are not adjusted for inflation. So that's almost $500 million worldwide back in 1989 when that film was released. That was a huge hit for Steven Spielberg, for Harrison Ford, obviously, and for Sean Connery. Number 2 worldwide hit was The Rock back in 1996 with Michael Bay, $336 million. Then Entrapment at $211 million. The Hunt for Red October, again, in early 90s money, $200 million worldwide. And actually, even though it was a fairly, not fairly, it was a pretty big flop here domestically, and, sadly, reportedly, Sean Connery was so displeased with the result of this film that he would retire from movie making. His last live-action film appearance, The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, was actually his 5th highest-grossing film worldwide at $179 million. So it did a little bit better worldwide than it did here domestically. But as I mentioned, those are all unadjusted for inflation. Although one thing that, even in that thing that you look, you have the 80s represented on there, you have the 90s represented on there, you have the 2000s represented on there. And so you see 3 different decades there just in his worldwide grosses. And as I mentioned, those are unadjusted for inflation. Let's look at domestically. When you look at his domestic box office hits here in North America and in the United States, when you adjust for inflation, you can really see just how massive, particularly the James Bond films were here in the United States. At number 1 is Thunderball, which when you adjust for inflation, grossed over $500 million domestically. That's just domestically. We're not even talking about worldwide. Then you have his number 2 highest grossing film was actually an ensemble film, The Longest Day, which tells the story of the Normandy invasions, D-Day. That is the number 2 film, over $500 million here domestically. Then at number 3, Goldfinger. That was another almost $500 million domestic hit when you adjust for inflation. Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, $447 million when you adjust for inflation. And then You Only Live Twice there at number 5, $323 million. There were also, The Rock would be up there in that top 10. One thing that you have to look at when you look at Sean Connery and the length and breadth of his career, he had major box office hits in the 1960s, the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s, then going into Entrapment at the turn of the century. That movie came out in 1999. And as I mentioned, even though the movie didn't do particularly well domestically, League of Extraordinary Gentlemen still topped $175 million worldwide back in 2003. And if he had continued to make films, I'm sure that he would have had even more up in those stratospheric numbers, because his appearance in any film really legitimized it in a way. He was such an icon. He was such a recognizable name, a recognizable voice. Of course, many people I saw bringing up Dragonheart, particularly people right around my age from 1996. I am the last one. He was an easy voice to impersonate. That's why you see the Daryl Hammond clips going around from Celebrity Jeopardy when he did the Sean Connery impersonations. He was a larger than life figure. I'm a huge James Bond fan, so obviously I think that he really did set the tone and the tenor for that role that you still see actors like Daniel Craig trying to live up to this day. He invented that character cinematically in the same way that Ian Fleming invented that character on the page. You look at things like The Untouchables. He won an Academy Award for that film. That is a really great movie. It's actually one of my favorites. I think that people definitely know it, but it's not spoken of in the same breath a lot of times as other crime films from the late 80s and early 90s, like Goodfellas. I think The Untouchables belongs right up there. He's so good in that film. Then you have appearances in movies like The Man Who Would Be King and Robin and Marion, Highlander, so many different kinds of movies, and yet he lent that vivaciousness and that personality to each and every one of them. And so even though he had been away from the public eye, hadn't made a movie in 17 years, was rarely seen in public for most of the later part of his life, it is very rare that you see somebody who had the kind of impact on the box office and on just creating fans around so many different kinds of movies as Sean Connery. From the action fans who like James Bond and The Rock, to the adventure fans who like Highlander and Indiana Jones, dramas like The Hunt for Red October. It's a bittersweet feeling, obviously, because you have lost such an icon, but at the same time, as I said before, you get to go back and reflect and really revisit how his performances have impacted audiences across the years on screen. So to Sir Sean Connery, rest in peace. Really a shadow that not many other actors have cast, and one that will not easily be replicated. So let's take a look back at the box office at a time when people were actually able to go to the movies. We're going back 19 years to the first weekend, November 2nd through the 4th of 2001, and that's when Monsters, Inc. had a massive $62.5 million debut. If that were adjusted to today's numbers, that would be well over $100 million. Pixar was just beginning to grow their brand at that time. Toy Story had only come out, I think, 6 years before then. So already Pixar asserting itself as a dominant box office force. Then you have the Jet Li movie, The One, which I haven't seen, but I know a lot of other people my age, hello Joe Star, really revere that movie, or at least love to watch it and laugh about it. But that was there at number 1. A Domestic Disturbance, starring John Travolta and Vince Vaughn. That's a 90s lineup for you. Also opening that week at number 3. Then K-Pax in its second week at week 2, and 13 Ghosts at week 2. Although, because of the naming convention of that film, I like to call it Thur 13 and Ghosts. So Thur 13 and Ghosts in its second week at number 2. K-Pax did not make all the money in the world, but was, I guess, kind of a sleeper hit back in 2001. Let's look at some of the notable releases. Also, some notable releases from the same week in box office history. Back in 1954, the movie that would be released in the United States as Godzilla, known as Gojira in Japan, was released on this weekend. Also in 1996, a big moment for a lot of the girls I went to high school with. Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet opened at number 1. I had a crush on Claire Danes as well, but Leonardo DiCaprio, that was the beginning of his heartthrob reign that would hit heights the next year when Titanic came out. Back in 2006, Borat was the number 1 film. in only 837 theaters, which even at that time, yes, movies opened in fewer theaters, but even at that time, for a movie to open at number one in under 1,000 theaters was a fairly rare thing. So the word was already out on Borat. It would expand to more theaters the next weekend. And then, believe it or not, 3 years ago, back in 2017, Thor Ragnarok opened to $122 million plus. That seems both like it couldn't have been 3 years ago and that it was 9 years ago. But yeah, Thor Ragnarok expanding the Thor brand 3 years ago this past weekend. Let's look at what people are watching at home. And as always, we're going to start with the streaming charts over on Amazon. The Craft Legacy, which is a sequel to the 1996 movie The Craft, produced by Blumhouse, was number one on the Amazon charts. Then you have Halloween Town, Hocus Pocus, and The Nightmare Before Christmas. There's a little bit of love, I'm sure, a little bit of spillover from people watching stuff for Halloween there. At numbers 2, 3, and 4, Love and Monsters at number 5, Antebellum at number 6, Scream and Ghostbusters also capitalizing on the Halloween season at number 7 and 8. Then you have 2020's Mulan at number 9, and Get Out getting in there. It may be an unconventional horror movie, but people still scratching that horror itch there at number 10. Let's look at what people are watching over on iTunes. At number 1 is Beetlejuice. Don't say that 2 more times. That was the number 1 movie for the Halloween weekend. That's what people wanted to watch on iTunes. Then we have After We Collided bumping down to number 2 after being number 1 last week. Hocus Pocus at number 3. Then several movies again that were jumping onto the Halloween season. 2018's Halloween at number 4. Then we have The Craft Legacy at number 5. Ghostbusters at number 6. World War Z at number 7. Halloween 1978, which I see that iTunes is now recategorized and called it John Carpenter's Halloween. It's Halloween. It's Halloween 1978's version at number 8. Then a new film called Spell there at number 9. Spell is a film from director Mark Tonderai, who's done a lot of television work. Jumping in on the Halloween season at number 9. And then at number 10, Scream. I love that people are going back to Scream and watching it. It's not necessarily one that I always saw popping up around Halloween all the time, but I think it's kind of gaining even more of that classic status as we're getting almost, hard to believe, it'll be 25 years, I think, next year since Scream came out. And finally, closing out with what people are watching on Netflix. At number 1 is the Netflix original film, Holidate. People just getting into the holiday season. They skipped right over Halloween. They're going straight to Thanksgiving and Christmas. At number 2 is Rogue City, which is a crime film from France. At number 3, I've actually heard some good buzz on this. It's a movie called His House, which is a horror film imported from the UK from director Remy Weeks. I have not had a chance to watch it yet, but I've heard some really good things about it. I think I might try to check it out, even though Halloween has now passed us by. At number 4 is Hubie Halloween. If you want to see my surprising review of that film, you can check that out right now. Secrets of the Saqqara Tomb at number 5. That's actually a documentary about an archaeologist's find in Cairo. That's where you get the one of those Universal monsters. You got the mummy in there. Then Over the Moon and Paranorman, holding over from last week at number 6 and 7. There's a movie called Nobody Sleeps in the Woods Tonight, which is a Polish horror movie at number 8. Then 1991's The Addams Family at number 9. And The Grinch rounding out the top 10. So a bunch of Halloween, and man, that Grinch, he's already been jumping in. We're on November 2nd. We're not even close to Thanksgiving yet. We've already got Christmas coming up on the Netflix charts. I guess that's just how it works nowadays. So before we close out, obviously tomorrow is election day here in the United States, and already people are preparing and getting ready for what I can only describe as the worst. We don't really know what is going to happen. First and foremost, if you have not yet voted and you are eligible to do so here in the United States, I would urge you please to find a way to safely vote. All states are taking the precautions that they need to. Hopefully you are in a state where voting is easy and accessible. Look up your rights. Please do not be deterred if there is a long line. Stay in line, but please be safe while you are doing so. If you've already voted, and we've already seen an avalanche of early voting, absentee voting, mail-in voting, please, thank you for doing that. But if you have not voted yet, please vote. I'm not going to pretend and say that I don't care who you vote for, but I'm not going to tell you who to vote for. That is a decision that you can make up your own mind on. I certainly have very strong thoughts, but that's not what I'm going to share right now. What I do want to share is a story that actually happened to Mara and I a couple weeks ago. actually right after we moved here to Arkansas, we were at a store waiting in line to buy a few things, a couple chairs, some stuff for the house, and a gentleman who was in front of us waved us and the 3 or 4 people behind us forward and said, "I want to take care of what you're getting today." He just said it was something that he wanted to do. His name was Marcus. He was obviously a very nice person, but he was also somebody who you could tell that day just got up and wanted to put some good out into the world. Now, I don't know Marcus. I'm probably never going to see Marcus again. Marcus didn't know who I was, and he didn't know who anybody else was in that line at the store. Now, it's highly unlikely, looking at the demographics and the political climate and the fact that we are a very, very divided nation politically, that all of us in that line shared the same politics. But in that moment, that didn't matter. This was an act of kindness that was done from one person to several other people, with no motivating factor other than just wanting to put some good out into the world. So as we approach tomorrow and what's going to transpire in the next 24 hours, the next 48 hours, the next 4 years, 8 years, however long, the thing that I really keep coming back to is the idea that, yes, we disagree as people, but we still share a country, we still share neighborhoods, we still share everything. And this is a line that every politician has said that, you could say is a trope at this point, but I really do think it is true that there is more that we share in common than there is that we do not share in common. It's just that those differences are often exploited by people who want to cement a grip and a hold on power or prestige or money or whatever else. I keep coming back to this act of kindness that was done to Mara and I, and we are trying now to repay that by putting, kindness out into the world. I think that's who we are at our core. And if we can just allow that to overcome our differences while not ignoring our differences, I really do think the world is going to be a better place. Sometimes we have to shut out the voices that are telling us that we are enemies, that we're supposed to fight each other and be against each other, and listen to what we know inside is a common core of decency. Please get out, please vote, please be safe, and we will be back next week with a look at the box office. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.